A figure that endlessly fascinates people, one of the most analyzed figures of all time, is the dictator of Germany, Adolf Hitler. Coming to power in 1933 and fundamentally transforming German society, Hitler started a war that would consume the lives of millions of people. From documentaries of him on the History Channel to the endless analyses of the dictator by Mark Felton on YouTube, a recurring question is why Hitler generates so much mystique, why we're always fascinated to learn more about him. Years ago, I took a course on Hitler, and in it I was exposed to a couple sources that might help to elucidate this question. One source included a psychoanalysis of the dictator by the psychologist Carl Jung, and another introduced me to a catalog of Hitler's private conversations, a book called Hitler Speaks by Hermann Rauschning. So with these sources in mind, I'd answer the question in two ways. Hitler fascinates people first because the movement he founded was a religious movement, not just a political one. And second is the sexuality of Hitler, which plays a huge role in explaining his behavior, conduct, and belief system. So starting with the first point, let's unpack how National Socialism is a religion. Hitler himself said, quote, "Our movement is a religion." And when you look at the types of things the National Socialists valued, you can see this. One of the things they did is praise Islam and Mohammed frequently. And this gives us some insight into their psychology. Like Islam, they wanted the Hitler movement to be a kind of military religion, a belief system that would spread itself through war and conquest and take over and transform a huge part of the Earth's surface. Hitler's followers criticized Christianity, and this makes sense because Christianity did not expand in its early days through war, and Christianity also embodied a very different form of morality compared to Islam or National Socialism. Christianity was a religion of sacrifice, helping the weak, helping the vulnerable, being pious, and being humble. This is the opposite of the Darwinistic, competitive, and secular morality of National Socialism. Some people speculate whether the Hitler movement would have been able to coexist with Christianity in the post-World War II world had the Germans won the war, and it's a difficult question to answer. If you look at Alfred Rosenberg or Himmler, they literally built these huge amphitheaters and these esoteric temples that were more or less intruding on the ritual place of Christianity in society. It may be Christianity could have persisted in Germany as an alternate form of morality, similar to how Taoism and Buddhism coexisted in China. Or it could be the religion might have been replaced, as there were some National Socialists who were starkly anti-Christian and wanted to do away with it entirely in Germany. Similar to Christianity, National Socialism had martyrs. For example, the demonstrators who were killed when marching in the beer hall putsch with Hitler. It had a mythology, this racial idea of the Aryan race, that the Aryans were in this racial war with the Jews and other ethnicities, and this Manichaean idea that the Aryans were noble and superior and good, and the other races were inferior or duplicitous or immoral. And the Hitler movement even had a mythological origin story, where the Aryans emigrated from Atlantis or Lemuria or Tibet, or one of these fantastical places, to Central Europe. If you think of Hitler as a prophetic figure, you can interpret him as a kind of secular prophet or nihilistic prophet. And he does actually accept this mantle in Hitler Speaks. Jung used a more spiritual analogy and compared Hitler to Odin, or some kind of high priest figure of Germanic mythology. Mussolini, in one of his memoirs, recounts how Hitler viewed himself, that he thought he literally embodied the racial soul or national soul of the Germans. Other than as a prophet, you can also think of Hitler as a nihilistic philosopher. Nihilism means that only what we can physically see or experience is real. And so for Hitler, what was real was the Darwinist question of survival of the fittest. The Hitler movement was very modern in embracing this idea. So for them, race was real, the German race was real, And one's objective in life was to advance the interests of your race or group to the disadvantage of everyone else. So if you're a German, you're in the in-group, and Hitler is advancing your interests and is advantageous to you. And if you're not a German, you're in the racial outgroup, and you're excluded from the vision he has for Europe and for Germany. A weakness of Hitler's Darwinism is that it doesn't have any room for compassion or sympathy. It has this impatience to it, this intolerance to the banality of life and procreation, something which itself comes from Hitler's sexual psychology. And then, of course, there's this huge irony that Hitler embraces Darwinism and then loses the war, which means in his own ideology, National Socialism is unfit and should destroy itself as inferior, which ultimately it does when it turns into a kind of suicide cult at the end of the war. A unique feature of Hitler's philosophy is that while it's deeply racist and prejudiced, in its racism he resolves one of the big problems of the 20th century, which is the class question. So Karl Marx, in the Victorian age, identified this problem of wealth inequality, this conflict between the rich and poor that causes this fundamental tension in society. And his answer was that labor should rise up, seize control of the state, redistribute wealth, and create a classless system. So this was attempted in the East, in Russia and China. In the West, they didn't do this, but instead created a different system where they maintained capitalism and inequality, but implemented social welfare instead. So the Hitler movement does something different from each of these. In theory, race substitutes itself for class as the primary means of identity. So your class interests become subordinated to your racial interests. So there's still inequality, but in theory, the state plays this regulatory role in redistributing wealth and resources, because everyone, if you're a member of the racial in-group, has this innate, intrinsic value as a part of the community. So this might mean the interests of a big German industrialist might be seized or subordinated to the interests of the state to advance the interests of the country or the group as a whole. Some more points on the religious nature of Hitler's movement. You can see how, just like in a Christian society, National Socialism slowly infiltrated and permeated everything like a kind of octopus. You have the indoctrination of the Hitler Youth, you have the fascist charitable organizations, you have the German labor union, which is run by the party, and you have party members making up the elite of the military with the SS. So you have this system where you have the German society, let's say 90% of the population, then you have the party members who are like the priesthood who make up 10%, and then you have the Führer or dictator who is this one individual. If we make another comparison with Islam, the Hitler movement has this idea of social ecstasy. And what this is a secular version of the subordination of the individual to the divine that you see in Islam. So in Hitler's religion, you get conscripted, you go off to war, you sacrifice yourself, you serve the fatherland, and there's no promise of an afterlife here. But in theory, you have this redemption because your sacrifice benefits your racial group. Your sacrifice elevates your group, and then you live on through the continued life and the progress of your group. A final point we should mention here is how in Germanic mythology, the world ends in Ragnarok, which is this epic final battle where everyone fights. All the gods and heroes, the Valkyries, good and evil, and ultimately the world is destroyed. And it is fascinating, almost like it's something built into the nature of the Germans, that this was actually the result. This was what happened in World War II. There was this attempt at apotheosis that fails and then destroys the whole civilization. And they experience the twilight of the gods, like we can listen to in Richard Wagner's music. And I think that this Herculean, destructive, nihilistic world event is a big part of the fascination of Hitler and his movement. If we turn to the second point and look at Hitler's sexuality, we can see how it overlaps with this idea of National Socialism as a kind of religion. Many religions have this idea of celibacy, the idea that if you practice celibacy, it brings certain benefits or powers. One of the generals said, quote, Hitler was a solitary figure with only his big plans to keep him company. And we do see this persona he develops as being an almost ascetic, anti-sexual leader, with him sublimating his sexual energy into politics. So Hitler, though we said he's this nihilistic figure, this atheistic figure in terms of what his philosophy teaches, ironically appropriates this religious idea and incorporates it into his aesthetic of who he is as a leader. So he becomes a kind of celibate emperor or a Teutonic knight, and he maintains this abstinence his whole life, cultivating the idea he's a bachelor married to Germany. And only at the end of the war does he stop this, marry Eva Braun, presumably have his first sexual experience ever with her, and then end this lifelong commitment to being an unsexual figure. So it shows Hitler and the Germans had this archaic system of sexual morality that valued abstinence and how abstinence sublimates sexual energy to another purpose. So this was a concept that still existed and was valued in the 20th century. And I think the alienness of Hitler's sexual ethics is another variable in what gives Hitler this mystique and what makes him so fascinating. If Hitler had won the war, it raises the question of how succession would have worked with him being this kind of celibate figure. And I think if he had accomplished all his foreign policy goals, meaning if he had beaten Russia in the war, then I think the Führer position would have become, to use Tom Holland's language, a kind of sacral figure. And you might have had some kind of oligarchy or council government that would have succeeded him, consisting of figures like Speer or Göring or Himmler, a small group of maybe 3 or 5 individuals. Or a different type of transition of power to the Volkshalle. If we look at the psychology of sex and how it underlies so much of human behavior, we can see how the sex energy of Hitler was sublimated into his charisma. He gives these captivating speeches that were really like performances where he tried to spiritually connect with the German people. At the same time, we can see how Hitler's abstinence and sexual frustration led him to manifest the death drive, the principle of Thanatos. In one of Mussolini's meetings with Hitler, he describes him as a sexual psychopath. And we see this in his desire to conquer, to oppress, to dominate, to destroy the other, as well as in this desire to do everything in his lifetime, that he can't wait, that he can't leave tasks to his successor. In his psychology, it all comes from this sexual insecurity and desire to improve himself and have control that he has. And we see this ultimately in the destruction of Germany, in Hitler's suicide, and how all his acolytes start to commit suicide at the end of the war. That ultimately it's the manifestation of this death principle that has its origin in the sexual psychology of Hitler. So I think this is what makes Hitler so fascinating, is that he creates this kind of racial religion, this sort of nihilistic religion, and it's this other element of Hitler's alien and unique form of sexuality.